My name is Emily Carter. I'm 34 years old, and this is the story of how one Christmas shattered everything I thought I knew about family and how I chose to take revenge. Some people say family is forever, but what happens when that very family turns its back on you, again and again, until you have nothing left but bitterness? Growing up, I always felt like the shadow in my family. My older sister Grace was the golden child. She was the firstborn, the straight A student, the one who always seemed to make my mother proud. Grace could walk into a room, and my mother, Linda, would beam with pride, bragging about her achievements. I, on the other hand, was the afterthought, the one who tried, but never enough. If Grace got an A, I got a lecture about why my B wasn't good enough. If Grace landed a good job, my own career was just average. Nothing I ever did seemed to matter. Still, I tried. I kept coming home for Christmas, year after year, even though it was painful. Christmas was always my mother's holiday. The decorations, the food, the family pictures and matching outfits. It was her stage to showcase her perfect family. I played my part because I still craved acceptance, even as an adult. But this past year, everything changed. A week before Christmas, I got a call from my mother. Her voice was cold, almost rehearsed. "Emily," she said, "this year we're not expecting you for Christmas. Grace is hosting at her place, and, well, there won't be enough room." At first, I didn't understand. Not enough room? Grace's house was huge, bigger than mine and Michael's put together. I waited for a laugh, some sign that it was a bad joke. But there was none, just silence on the other end of the line. I felt the words sink into me like knives. I had always been the outsider, but never before had they excluded me entirely from Christmas. It was as if my mother had finally said out loud what she had been showing me for years. "You don't belong here." I wanted to scream, to ask her why, to remind her I was her daughter too. But instead I swallowed the pain and forced myself to respond. "Okay, Mom, I understand." I didn't, of course. I never would. But I refused to let her hear me cry. That night, I told my husband, Michael. He looked at me with disbelief, then anger. "She actually said that? Emily, that's cruel. You don't deserve this." I shrugged, trying to seem stronger than I felt. "It's fine. It's just one Christmas." Michael pulled me into his arms. "We'll make our own Christmas, just us." And that's what we did. On Christmas Eve, while my family gathered at Grace's grand house, I stayed home with Michael. We lit our tree, cooked dinner together, and exchanged gifts. He tried to make me laugh, and for a while, I almost believed I was okay. But late at night, when the house was quiet, I checked my phone. Not a single call, not even a text from my parents. They didn't miss me at all. On Christmas Day, we went for a walk in the cold air, and Michael held my hand tightly. I told myself this was enough, that my little family was all I needed, and maybe it should have been. But 2 days later, everything shifted. I woke up to my phone buzzing nonstop. At first, I thought it was a glitch, but when I picked it up, I froze. 30 missed calls, all from my mother, my father, even Grace. 30. My chest tightened. For a moment, I thought someone had died. My heart raced as I scrolled through the call log, my stomach churning with questions. Why now? Why, after shutting me out, were they suddenly desperate to reach me? I didn't call back right away. Instead, I just sat there, staring at the screen, feeling the weight of all those unanswered calls. A part of me wanted to ignore them, to let them feel the sting of silence the way I had felt it. Another part of me was terrified. I didn't know it then, but those 30 missed calls were the beginning of everything, the beginning of the downfall of my family, the beginning of my revenge. And nothing would ever be the same. When I saw those 30 missed calls on my phone, my first instinct was panic. My mind went straight to the worst possible scenario. My father collapsing, a car accident, something tragic that would explain the sudden desperation. But another part of me, the darker part, whispered, or maybe they just need you now, because their perfect world is falling apart. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the screen. Michael walked in with a cup of coffee, still half asleep. He glanced at me, then at the phone in my hands. "Emily, what's wrong?" I showed him the screen. He frowned. 30? From your mom. "And my dad. And Grace," I added. My voice was flat, but my hands were trembling. Michael set the coffee down and sat beside me. "Do you want to call back?" I bit my lip. I didn't know what I wanted. For years, I had been the one chasing after their attention, always the one trying to fix things. But now, after they had told me I wasn't welcome, something in me resisted. It felt good, almost, to let them wait. "Not yet," I finally said. If it was something truly life-threatening, they'd have kept calling. Michael hesitated but nodded. "Then wait. Don't let them control you." For the rest of the day, I carried my phone with me everywhere. Every vibration made my chest tighten, but no new calls came. By evening, curiosity won. My fingers hovered over my mother's number, my pulse quickening as I finally pressed call back. She answered on the first ring. "Emily!" Her voice was frantic, breathless, almost unrecognizable. "Why haven't you answered? Where have you been?" I froze, hearing something I had never heard in her tone before. Need. "What's going on, Mom?" I asked cautiously. There was shouting in the background, voices overlapping, and then she lowered her voice. "It's Grace and David. There was an incident at Christmas dinner. Things got out of hand. We need you here." I almost laughed. "We need you here." Those were words I had never heard from her. Not when I was a child being bullied at school. Not when I moved out and begged her to visit. Not when I miscarried my first pregnancy and cried alone. But now, suddenly, she needed me. "What kind of incident?" I pressed. Before she could answer, another voice cut in, Grace's, sharp and panicked. "Is that Emily? Let me talk to her." "No," my mother snapped. Then, in a softer tone, "Just come, Emily, please. We'll explain everything." I felt my jaw tighten. The irony was suffocating. 2 days ago, they didn't even have room for me at Christmas. And now, apparently, I was the one person who could fix their chaos. "I'll think about it," I said coldly, then hung up. Michael stared at me when I told him. "They need you? After throwing you away like garbage?" "Exactly," I said. For the first time in years, I wasn't the desperate one. They were. That night, I lay awake replaying my mother's words. Something big had happened, something that made her swallow her pride enough to beg me. And I realized I wasn't just curious. I wanted to know. But not because I cared about them. I wanted to know because knowledge was power. The next morning, my father called. Unlike my mother, his voice was calm, but there was a heaviness to it. "Emily, sweetheart," he said quietly, "please come. Your mother and sister are falling apart. You've always been the strong one. Maybe you can hold this family together." I almost choked. The strong one? For decades, they had treated me like I was weak, insignificant. Now suddenly, I was the pillar? "I'll think about it, Dad," I repeated. But inside, something dark was blooming. For once, the roles were reversed. By the third day, Grace herself finally called. I answered, if only to hear the desperation in her voice. "Emily, listen," she said quickly, her words tumbling over each other. "David, he embarrassed me in front of everyone. He was drunk, and he said things, horrible things, about our marriage, about Mom and Dad, about me. Everything is ruined. Please, I need you here." I closed my eyes and let the moment wash over me. My perfect sister, the one who had it all, was begging me. "I don't know, Grace," I said softly. "You didn't need me at Christmas. Why now?" There was a long pause. Then her voice cracked. "Because you're the only one who isn't against me right now. Please, Em." I didn't answer. I just hung up. As I set the phone down, Michael studied me carefully. "What are you thinking?" I stared at the quiet screen, my heart pounding with something that felt dangerously close to satisfaction. "I'm thinking," I whispered, "that maybe it's finally my turn." And with that, the idea of revenge, faint, fragile, took root in me. I didn't rush to my family's side, not this time. Instead, I waited, letting the silence do what it had never done before. Give me power. Every hour I didn't show up, I knew they were pacing, calling, whispering about where I was. And for once, I wasn't the one desperate for their attention. On the 4th day, I finally drove to my parents' house. Michael offered to come, but I told him no. This was something I had to face alone. The closer I got to their neighborhood, the heavier the air felt. Christmas decorations still blinked in the cold night, but the magic was gone. It was just lights hanging over broken families. When I walked inside, the tension hit me like a wall. My mother was sitting in the living room, her face pale and drawn, her hands clutched around a glass of wine. My father stood by the fireplace, staring into the flames. And Grace looked nothing like the polished sister I'd grown up with. Her hair was unkempt, her eyes red and swollen, her voice hoarse from crying. "Emily," my mother breathed, standing up quickly. For a second, I thought she might hug me, but she stopped short, as if the gesture would cost her too much pride. Grace, on the other hand, ran to me. "Thank God you're here," she whispered, grabbing my hands. Her fingers were ice cold. I pulled away gently. "What happened?" There was a silence that stretched too long, and then my mother spoke. "It was David. He ruined Christmas." Grace let out a broken laugh. "Ruined? He destroyed me, Mom. Don't sugarcoat it." She turned to me, her eyes wide and frantic. "He was drunk, completely out of control, in front of everyone, our aunts, cousins, Dad, Mom. He stood up and started tearing me apart. Said our marriage was a lie, said I was a parasite, living off his money, said Mom always spoiled me, and I turned into a failure because of it." I blinked, stunned. Grace's voice trembled as she went on. "He said he never loved me, that he cheated on me more times than he could count. He laughed about it. He humiliated me in front of the entire family, Emily. He stripped everything from me." My father cleared his throat, as if trying to keep order. "It was ugly. People left. Your mother tried to calm him down, but he wouldn't stop." I stared at them all, my mind spinning. Grace, the flawless sister, the perfect daughter, being torn down by the very man she built her life with. For years, she had been untouchable, adored by everyone. And now, here she was, broken, begging me to stand with her. My mother spoke again, her voice softer. "We thought, if you were here, maybe it wouldn't have escalated like that. Maybe David wouldn't have—" She trailed off. I almost laughed. "So, let me get this straight. You didn't want me at Christmas, but you think my presence would have saved the day?" Her face tightened. "Don't twist this, Emily. We made a mistake, all right? We just need you now." There it was again. "We need you." I looked at Grace, who was crumbling in front of me, and for a moment I felt a flicker of pity. But underneath it, deeper, darker, was something else. Satisfaction. For once, Grace wasn't the shining star. For once, she was the one begging me to stay, to help, to fix what she couldn't. "Emily," she whispered, tears spilling down her face. "Please, you're my sister. I can't do this alone." I studied her, my silence stretching long enough to make her squirm. Then I finally said, "I'll think about it." Her mouth fell open, stunned. My mother glared at me, but I didn't care. For once, the balance had shifted. They needed me, and I had the power to decide whether to give it or not. That night when I left their house, I didn't feel broken anymore. I felt something entirely different. I felt the first real taste of what revenge might look like. And I knew I wanted more. Driving home that night, I felt a strange mix of anger, curiosity, and an unfamiliar thrill. Michael was waiting for me, a worried frown creasing his face. "How is everyone?" he asked. I shrugged. "The same, broken, desperate." He didn't understand yet. He never fully understood the weight my family had carried on me for decades. Grace had always been the favorite, the untouchable one, the shining star my mother constantly compared me to. And now, for the first time in my life, that star was flickering. I sat in the quiet of our living room later that night, staring into the darkness. Memories I'd buried for years began to surface, unbidden and sharp. Childhood Christmases where I had sat in the corner, ignored, while Grace unwrapped gifts under my mother's proud gaze. My birthdays, overshadowed by Grace's accomplishments. My achievements, small, significant to me. Dismissed, criticized, or forgotten entirely. I remembered one Christmas in particular. I must have been 10, Grace was 15, and we had both written letters to Santa. My letter was simple. I wanted my family to notice me, just once. Grace's letter? A long list of expensive toys, a bike, a dollhouse. That year, my mother cried tears of joy over Grace's gifts and barely glanced at mine. I tried to hide my tears behind the couch cushions, pretending it didn't matter, but the hurt lodged itself in my chest. And now, decades later, it mattered more than ever. The hurt had never healed. It had festered, silent but constant, like a shadow stretching over every family gathering, every conversation, every exclusion, every cold comment, every subtle humiliation had built a foundation for this moment. For the first time, the balance had shifted. The realization hit me hard. This wasn't just about Christmas. It never had been. It was about a lifetime of neglect, favoritism, and unspoken cruelty. It was about my mother's constant need to mold me into someone I was never allowed to be. It was about Grace's perfect image, which had been a constant reminder of my own failure. And it was about me, finally realizing that I didn't have to be the victim anymore. I could feel the beginnings of something new, a plan, a careful, deliberate thought that had been dormant for years. I didn't want to be their fixer. I didn't want to patch the cracks in a family that had treated me like I didn't belong. I wanted control. I wanted them to understand, in the deepest possible way, that I mattered. And for the first time, I allowed myself to imagine what that might look like. Not just confrontation, not just anger, but something more potent, something that would leave no doubt in their minds who had always held the quiet power. I thought about Grace, trembling in my arms, asking me for help. She didn't know me really. She had never known the Emily who had cried alone, the Emily who had suffered silently while the world celebrated her sister. And now, the Emily she was seeing, the Emily in control, the Emily who could choose to help or withhold, is someone completely foreign. I realized, with a cold clarity, that the old wounds had shaped me into this, that the hurt and neglect, the years of being unseen and unheard, had forged a version of myself capable of patience, calculation, and, if needed, ruthless action. Sitting there in the dark, I made a quiet vow. I would not be the powerless daughter, the ignored sister, the shadow in the family anymore. I would watch, I would wait, and I would act, but on my terms. And when I finally did, it wouldn't just be about Christmas. It would be about every moment they had dismissed me, every slight they had inflicted, every year I had been excluded. This was the beginning, not of their punishment, but of the reckoning that had been decades in the making. The next few days were quiet, too quiet. My family was still reeling from the Christmas disaster, but I noticed something subtle. Their calls became more frequent, more desperate. I hadn't returned them all, and I could feel the tension each time my phone buzzed. For once, they were the ones waiting. Michael watched me closely, sensing the shift. "Emily, be careful," he warned one evening. "This feeling you have, it can be intoxicating, but revenge can burn you too." I smiled, not out of malice, but because he didn't understand. He thought I wanted to hurt them for the sake of it. No, this wasn't about hatred, not entirely. It was about balance. It was about reclaiming the respect and power that had always been denied to me. I began slowly, carefully observing my mother and sister. Their vulnerability was fascinating to watch. My mother, who had always seemed untouchable, was now anxious, wringing her hands, pacing the house. Grace, the flawless one, had lost her composure entirely, hiding behind frantic phone calls and frantic attempts to salvage her reputation. I realized how much influence I had simply by choosing when and how to respond. I could calm them, or let them spiral further. I could step in as the strong one, or I could watch as their fragile world crumbled. I decided to test it. That afternoon, my mother called again. I answered casually. "Emily." "Oh, thank God," she said, relief flooding her voice. "Mom," I said slowly, letting the silence stretch. She shifted nervously. "Are you coming over? You have to see what's happening. Everything's falling apart," she pleaded. I paused, tasting the power in that pause. Then, finally, I said, "I might. I'll think about it." The silence that followed was electric. I could almost hear her heartbeat through the phone. She didn't argue. She didn't beg. She just waited, desperate, powerless, and fully aware that the control had shifted. Later that night, I sat with Michael and recounted the exchange. He was both proud and concerned. "You see how much control you have?" he asked. "I do," I admitted, "and I like it." For the first time, I wasn't the child, the ignored daughter, the secondary figure. For the first time, they were dependent on me. And it was intoxicating. I started thinking beyond mere control. If my family could panic and plead for me now, what else could I influence? What truths could I uncover? What injustices could I expose? My mind, which had spent decades trying to fit into a family that rejected me, was now calculating. Every word they said, every plea for help, was data, evidence of their weakness, of their dependence on me. I began keeping notes, quietly recording conversations, remembering every slip, every lie, every subtle manipulation. I knew their secrets now, more than they suspected, and for the first time, I realized I could use them. By the end of the week, I had made a decision. I would act, but I would do so strategically. No rash moves, no impulsive confrontations. I would plan carefully, watch patiently, and strike when the time was right. That night, as I lay in bed, Michael asleep beside me, I finally admitted to myself, I had tasted power, and I couldn't let it go. The Emily who had been invisible for so long, the Emily who had been pushed aside, was gone. In her place was someone patient, observant, and prepared, someone ready to reclaim what was always hers. And with that thought, a cold thrill ran through me. The reckoning had begun. 2 days later, I decided it was time to confront them. Carefully, deliberately. Not with anger, not with shouting, but with the kind of cold clarity that only years of neglect can forge. I left Michael at home, knowing this had to be my moment, my scene. When I arrived, the house was tense. My mother, Linda, was hovering near the doorway, her posture rigid, her lips pressed into a thin line. My father, Richard, sat quietly in the living room, staring at the floor, hands folded tightly. And Grace, she was pacing, muttering fragments of complaints and sobs under her breath, her usual poise gone. I stepped inside, letting the door click softly behind me. The room went quiet. I felt the shift immediately. I wasn't coming as a helpless daughter. I was stepping in as an observer, a judge, a force they couldn't manipulate. "Emily," my mother said cautiously, almost a whisper, "We're glad you came." I gave her a small, polite smile, one that didn't reach my eyes. "I'm here," I said simply. And in that moment, the words held power. Not authority, exactly, but weight. The kind of weight that comes from being someone they've ignored for decades, someone they underestimated, someone who now had the choice to engage, or not. Grace stopped pacing and looked at me, her expression torn between relief and desperation. "I don't know what to do," she said quietly. "Everything fell apart so fast. David, he humiliated me in front of everyone. Mom, I don't even know where to start." I didn't answer immediately. I just studied them. Their anxiety, their fear, their helplessness. It was almost intoxicating. All those years they had controlled me with favoritism, with criticism, with cold disregard. And now, for the first time, they were powerless. Finally, I spoke. "You made your choices," I said calmly. "Now you have to deal with the consequence. And yes, I know exactly what happened. I know what David said, what he did, and how it's affected you all." My mother's face tightened. "Emily, No," I interrupted gently but firmly. "Don't speak. I'm not here to fix this for you. I'm here to see it clearly, to understand what you've done to yourselves." Grace's hands shook as she clutched the back of a chair. "Please, Emily, help me. I can't do this alone." I studied her, noting the cracks in her composure. "You didn't need me at Christmas," I reminded her softly. "And yet now, suddenly, you're begging for help. Funny how timing works." The air in the room was thick. My father shifted uncomfortably. My mother's eyes darted to me, searching for some sign of compliance. But I gave nothing. I was a mirror. They saw their desperation reflected in me, but I was not moved. Over the next hour, I listened as they recounted the chaos. David's drunken tirade, Grace's humiliation, my mother's frantic attempts to control the situation. I asked questions subtly, almost conversationally. But each question revealed more about their failures, their lies, their dependencies. And I realized something fundamental. For the first time, I wasn't powerless. I was seeing the truth. I was the only one who could see it without panic, without denial. By the time I left, I hadn't offered solutions. I hadn't reassured anyone. I hadn't tried to patch the cracks. But I had gained something far more valuable: clarity, control, and the first real taste of the leverage I had over them. As I walked to my car, I felt a surge of exhilaration. They had underestimated me for decades, and now the balance had shifted. I wasn't the ignored daughter anymore. I was the one with power. For the first time in my life, I was truly free. And for the first time, I knew I could shape the next moves. After that confrontation, I didn't immediately act. I spent the next few days quietly observing, listening, and thinking. But the deeper I looked, the more I realized that what I had witnessed at Christmas was only the surface of a much bigger picture. I started asking subtle questions when I called my mother. "How are things with Grace and David?" I asked casually, letting my tone remain neutral. My mother, desperate to appear in control, stumbled over her words. "Oh, just minor issues. Nothing serious," she said, too quickly. I knew better. I had seen the panic in her eyes, the lines etched deep into her face from worry. There was something she wasn't telling me. The next day, I spoke to a cousin who had been at the disastrous Christmas dinner. She was hesitant at first, but I encouraged her gently. Soon, the truth spilled out. Grace and David were in financial trouble, serious trouble. Loans, debts, bad investments. David's arrogance and greed had left them on the edge of ruin. My mother had been quietly covering for them, ready to dip into family savings to keep the facade of perfection intact. Everything clicked. Grace had been living her perfect life, flaunting her wealth, her marriage, and her social status, while hiding a crumbling foundation. My mother had always favored her, indulged her, rewarded her mistakes, and now the cracks were showing. I felt a cold thrill run through me. For years, I had been dismissed, ignored, excluded from their perfect little world, and now that world was cracking, revealing all the lies and weaknesses beneath. I began to see possibilities. Knowledge is power, they say, and I had more than anyone knew. I learned about unpaid debts, hidden bankruptcies, and even some of David's shady business dealing. Grace had convinced my parents to lend her money for years, covering up failures and humiliations. My parents had been complicit, blindly protecting her image. The pieces fit together perfectly. I realized that I could use this information. Carefully, subtly, I could expose the cracks and force my family to confront the truth, without ever revealing my own role, at least at first. I started documenting everything. I took notes on conversations, recorded incidents, and cataloged inconsistencies. Every lie, every cover-up, every desperate attempt to maintain appearances became a weapon I could use. By the end of the week, I knew one thing for certain. The perfect image of my family, of Grace, of my mother, was an illusion. And I held the map to its collapse. When I told Michael about it, he looked concerned. "Emily, be careful. You're stepping into dangerous territory. This isn't just about hurt feelings anymore. People could get seriously hurt." I nodded, acknowledging his concern, but deep down I felt no fear. For the first time, I had the upper hand. For the first time, I was no longer the powerless daughter. I was the observer, the keeper of truth, and the one who could decide how far to take it. And as I lay in bed that night, the quiet thrill of control and possibility coursing through me, I realized something profound. My family had spent a lifetime underestimating me. But I had been watching, waiting, learning, and now the scales were about to tip. The reckoning I had long imagined was no longer a fantasy. It was real, and I was ready to act. Once I had uncovered the truth, I realized that patience was my greatest weapon. My family was vulnerable, fragile, and desperate to maintain the illusion of perfection. And I, finally, held the leverage. I began quietly reaching out to people connected to Grace and David, former business associates of David's, old friends who knew about their financial missteps, even distant cousins who had witnessed small scandals. I didn't act overtly. I asked questions, I listened, I documented. Each detail became a piece of the puzzle. The thrill was intoxicating. I was no longer invisible, no longer the overlooked daughter. I was the one who knew the truth, and the truth, I realized, could change everything. Meanwhile, my family continued their frantic attempts to fix things. My mother called constantly, begging for updates, seeking reassurance. Grace was frantic, trying to spin stories, to hide evidence, to maintain the FA aid, but I stayed calm. I withheld information, allowed tension to build, and let their desperation become tangible. One evening, Michael asked, "Are you sure this is the right way?" I smiled at him, quietly confident. It's the only way they'll understand. They've spent a lifetime taking me for granted. Now it's their turn to feel powerless. I started to subtly manipulate conversations, planting small seeds. A cousin would casually mention seeing David's unpaid bills. A neighbor would note some questionable behavior at a company event. Each fragment of truth seeped into my family's awareness, without me ever having to say a word. The power I felt was heady. Every phone call I ignored, every vague answer I gave, every knowing look I offered, they were all tools. My mother's anxiety increased. Grace's panic grew, and I watched, quietly enjoying the shift. At home, Michael reminded me, "Don't lose yourself in this. Don't let it consume you." But I couldn't help it. For the first time, the Emily who had been silenced, overlooked, and dismissed had found her voice. And she was being heard, whether they liked it or not. I knew I was close to the tipping point. The pieces were in place, the evidence was gathered, and the family's cracks were widening. I had the power to either stop here or push further, to expose the truths they had hidden for years. And I realized with a mix of fear and exhilaration that I wanted to push further. The reckoning wasn't just coming, it was inevitable. And I would be the one holding the pen, deciding exactly how the story would unfold. The first signs of real chaos appeared quietly, almost imperceptibly. Grace had been working overtime to keep her life together. Calls to creditors, frantic texts to David, desperate pleas to my parents for help. But every small misstep, every overlooked detail, now had consequence. I didn't interfere overtly. I didn't need to. My careful observations, the subtle hints I planted, the fragments of truth seeping into their awareness, all of it began to destabilize them. Grace was losing her composure faster than I could have imagined. She began lashing out, blaming my mother, David, even distant friends for her problems. My mother, usually so commanding, started to panic at the cracks in her carefully maintained façade. Then, one evening, I acted. I had compiled documents, photos, and messages that revealed the full extent of David's financial misconduct, the unpaid debts, the lies he had told to cover them up, and the extent of Grace's desperate cover-ups. I didn't confront anyone directly. Instead, I made sure the evidence found its way into the hands of someone they couldn't control, a distant cousin who worked in the same financial industry. Within hours, the dominoes began to fall. Grace's financial irregularities were quietly reported to the authorities. David's fraudulent deals came under scrutiny. My parents received warnings from lawyers and bank officials. And the family, once a fortress of appearances, began to fracture publicly. The tension in the household became unbearable. My mother called me constantly, her voice trembling. "Emily, please, we need you. You can fix this, can't you?" I listened calmly, offering nothing, no reassurance, no advice, just silence. And in that silence, the full weight of their failures pressed down on them. For once, they weren't in control. For once, they were the ones scrambling, desperate, exposed. Grace finally confronted me, tears streaming down her face. "Emily, I don't understand. How did this happen? How did it get this far?" I leaned back, letting her panic wash over me. "I don't know, Grace. Maybe it's just karma catching up." My voice was soft, almost conversational, but each word struck with precision. They couldn't argue, not really. The evidence was undeniable. The secrets they had hidden for so long were now public, and they had no one to blame but themselves. That night, as I returned home, I felt an unfamiliar sense of power. I had never sought to hurt them personally, at least not physically. But I had exposed the truth, the hidden rot beneath the surface of their perfect lives. And in doing so, I had claimed control over a family that had always tried to control me. Michael looked at me as I walked in, concern and awe in his eyes. "Emily, you did it," he said quietly. I nodded. "I didn't create this chaos," I said. "I just let the truth breathe." For the first time, I realized how far I had come. I was no longer the overlooked daughter, the powerless sister. I was a force to be reckoned with, and there was no turning back. The reckoning had begun, and it would not end until everyone understood the consequences of their actions. The next few weeks were nothing short of catastrophic for my family. Grace's world, once so meticulously polished, began to crumble in ways even I hadn't fully anticipated. The financial institutions she relied on were calling constantly, threatening legal action. David's arrogance and reckless behavior had finally caught up to him, and he was spiraling, shouting at anyone who tried to help. My mother, Linda, had always presented herself as the calm, commanding matriarch. Now she seemed small, fragile, and terrified. She paced the house, muttering apologies, trying desperately to salvage what little control remained. My father, Richard, usually quiet and passive, watched helplessly. Knowing that all their attempts to protect Grace had failed, Grace reached out to me almost daily, her voice panicked. "Emily, please, you have to help me. I don't know what to do. I can't fix this." I listened carefully, letting her anxiety build. Every word, every plea, every trembling tone reminded me of the years I had spent being ignored and dismissed. For once, I had the upper hand, and I didn't rush to offer comfort. I let her suffer in the tension, letting reality hit her like it had never hit me when I was the one in pain. One afternoon, my mother confronted me. "Emily, you have to stop this. We're family. Please don't ruin us completely." I looked at her calmly, letting the weight of silence hang before I spoke. "I'm not ruining you. You did that yourselves. I'm just letting the truth be seen." The impact of my words was immediate. My mother's face paled, and she turned away, realizing she had no argument left. Grace shrieked in frustration, slamming a door behind her. The house, once a symbol of perfection, was now a storm of panic, guilt, and helplessness, and in the midst of it all, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and emptiness. I had achieved what I had longed for, not to humiliate them, not for cruelty's sake, but to finally claim the acknowledgement and respect I had never received. I had tipped the scales, but the cost was high. Watching my family unravel, even knowing it was deserved, left a hollow ache in my chest. The laughter of the past, the memories of Christmases long gone, and the bonds that should have been strong were now shattered. And yet, for the first time in my life, I didn't feel powerless. Grace's marriage collapsed. David left, angry and bitter, taking nothing but the chaos he had created. My mother's pride was broken, her attempts at authority reduced to whispers of regret. And my father, silent but knowing, seemed to finally see me, not as the shadowed daughter, but as someone capable, strong, and unflinching. That night, as I drove home, Michael held my hand and said quietly, "It's over now, Emily. They've learned their lesson." I nodded, but a part of me knew the story was far from over. The collapse was complete, yes, but the emotional wreckage, the scars, the bitterness, would linger, and I had to live with that too. For the first time, though, I felt truly free. I had survived, I had acted, and I had claimed my place, but the weight of my family's downfall pressed on me. A reminder that even when you win, the consequences of revenge are never without cost. And I realized with a cold clarity that life had changed forever, not just for them, but for me as well. By now, the ripple effects of the Christmas disaster and the exposure of secrets had reached every corner of my family's life. Grace was in disarray, moving from friend to friend, borrowing money, hiding from creditors, and trying to maintain a facade that no longer existed. David had become a liability, and my parents were left to pick up pieces they could never truly repair. I had carefully avoided direct confrontation, letting the chaos unfold naturally. Yet the sense of control I felt was intoxicating. Every call they made, every frantic attempt at damage control, reminded me of the years I had been powerless, invisible, and dismissed. One evening, I received a call from a distant relative who had been quietly helping me observe and document everything. "Emily, I think it's time," they said. "They're vulnerable, and there's no going back now. You can finalize the truth." I knew what they meant. It was time to expose the final pieces, the hidden betrayals that had been covered up for decades. The letters, the financial records, the confessions, the patterns of favoritism and neglect. All of it could now be presented in a way that left no room for denial. I arrived at my parents' home that night, my presence deliberate and calm. My mother and Grace were both visibly on edge, anticipating another confrontation. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The tension filled the room before a single word was spoken. "I've seen everything," I said softly. "Every lie, every hidden debt, every favor you've used to cover mistakes. Every time you chose Grace over me, every time you dismissed me." They recoiled as though I had struck them. Grace's hands trembled. My mother's eyes welled with tears. My father said nothing, but I could feel his quiet acknowledgement, his recognition of the truth I had laid bare. I handed over a folder containing the documents, the messages, the evidence. The look on their faces as they flipped through the pages was priceless. Shock, fear, and finally understanding. "This," I said, "is everything. Not just David's failures, not just Grace's mistakes, but the truth of how you treated me, the truth you ignored for years." Grace gasped. "Emily, you can't." I cut her off gently. "I can," and I did. Because I finally realized that waiting for you to see me, to value me, was futile. You never would have. But now, there's no escaping it. The weight of the revelation hit them hard. The exposure was not vindictive. It was undeniable. And as they struggled to absorb the consequence, I felt a strange calm wash over me. For years, I had been silenced, overlooked, and diminished. Now I was the one who held the power. And in that power, I found clarity. When I left that night, Michael waited, and I finally allowed myself a deep breath. "It's done," I said. "Yes," he replied softly. "It's done. You've reclaimed yourself." I knew he was right. The peak of the revenge, the culmination of years of neglect and dismissal, had been reached. And as I drove home, the city lights passing by, I understood something profound. The world had shifted, my family had changed, and I had finally stepped out of the shadow that had followed me for decades. The days that followed the peak of the revelation were strangely quiet. The storm had passed, leaving behind the wreckage of my family's image, but also a new clarity. Grace and David had retreated from public view, my mother was subdued, and my father seemed lost in reflection. And in the middle of it all, I felt a calm I had never known. For the first time, I could breathe. The tension of being invisible, overlooked, and dismissed for decades was gone. I had reclaimed my voice, my presence, and my power. But with that power came a sobering realization. The aftermath was mine to navigate, and the family I had known would never be the same. I started carefully rebuilding my boundaries. I spoke to my mother openly for the first time in years, setting limits on her attempts to manipulate or guilt me. "Mom," I said firmly one evening, "I'm not the daughter who will fix everything for you anymore. You need to take responsibility for your choices." She listened, nodding silently, her pride wounded, but her mind beginning to comprehend. My father remained quiet but respectful, finally acknowledging the woman I had become, someone who could no longer be overlooked. Grace, though still shaken, began to approach me differently. The frantic desperation in her voice was gone, replaced with tentative attempts at reconciliation. I was cautious, letting her know that forgiveness had to be earned, not demanded. I didn't want to erase the lessons she needed to learn. Michael, ever my anchor, reminded me gently, "Emily, you've done what you needed to do. But remember, power is only useful if it doesn't consume you." I nodded, understanding the truth in his words. For years, I had been consumed by the desire to be recognized, to matter, to be seen. Now that I had achieved that, I realized that control and revenge were not the end. They were a tool, a means to reclaim my life. I started to focus on rebuilding my own life, independent of the chaos that had defined my family. The relief was palpable, the freedom intoxicating. I could spend time with Michael, nurture our home, and finally exist as myself, rather than the shadowed daughter, the overlooked sister. And yet, I knew the scars of the past would remain. The memories of being dismissed, ignored, and underestimated were still alive within me. but they no longer held power over my future. I had faced them, wielded them, and emerged stronger, wiser, and more self-assured. By the end of that week, I realized something profound. The story was no longer about revenge, it was about reclamation. I had reclaimed my voice, my dignity, and my life. And in doing so, I had learned that sometimes the greatest victory is not in destroying those who wronged you, but in rising above, standing tall, and refusing to be invisible any longer. For the first time, I felt truly free. Weeks had passed since the chaos began, yet the aftershocks still rippled through my family. Grace was quieter now, subdued, her once proud demeanor replaced with cautious humility. David was gone from the picture, and my parents, humbled and thoughtful, had begun to reassess their own lives. The house felt emptier, colder, but also clearer, less cluttered by pretense, more honest in its fragile reality. I returned one evening to check on them, not to fix, not to console, but simply to witness the final stage of reckoning. My mother met me at the door, her face pale but her eyes attentive. For the first time in decades, she looked at me with respect. "Emily, I've been thinking a lot," she said softly. "I realize now how much I failed you." I studied her for a long moment, noting the genuine remorse in her voice. "Mom," I said quietly, "apologies don't erase years of being unseen, but acknowledgement is a start." Grace followed behind her, hesitant but sincere. "Emily, I was blind," she whispered. "I never realized what you went through. I thought I was the one struggling, but you carried everything silently. I don't know if I can ever make it right, but I want to try." I took a deep breath. I could feel the tension in the room, the weight of old wounds, grudges, and unspoken resentments. But I also felt something else, release. For years I had been the silent observer, the overlooked daughter, the one ignored, dismissed, and underestimated. Now I was the one who could choose, to forgive, to distance, or to let the truth be enough. "I don't need perfection," I said softly. "I need honesty. I need boundaries. I need to know that I won't be ignored again. If you can give me that, maybe we can start over." My mother nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "We'll try, Emily. We'll really try." Grace hesitated, then added, "I'll do whatever it takes. I see now how wrong I was." For the first time, the room felt lighter. The drama, the chaos, the years of favoritism and neglect, they weren't erased, but the balance had shifted. I had reclaimed my life, my voice, and my sense of self. I had taken the pain and injustice that had been inflicted upon me and transformed it into clarity, strength, and finally, power. Leaving their house that night, I felt a profound sense of closure. The reckoning was complete. I had navigated the storm, exposed the truth, and survived without losing myself in the process. My family was forever changed, but so was I, stronger, wiser, and no longer afraid to demand recognition and respect. As I drove home, the cool night air brushing against my face, I realized something I had longed to understand for years. Vengeance had its place, but true empowerment comes not from destruction, but from reclaiming your life, your voice, and your dignity. And in that moment, I felt free, truly, irrevocably free for the first time in my life.